begin to start our conversation about the terrific day in 1917, I learned something new today, and I want to recognize the firefighters and the police officers who are here, who on that day in our city were the first responders who came to the aid of their fellow citizens. And for the fire service, I learned today that losing the number of firefighters that they have is the largest loss of life in firefighting in Canadian history still to this day. So you can only imagine the devastation of the explosion, but also the aftermath of that and the impact on the human side that happened to individual families and people. And as all of us know, when we have a trauma in our own families, we very quickly need people to lean on. And that doesn't matter who we are or what we do. When that trauma happens, we need someone to lean on to give us the strength to deal with the challenges that are about to face us. And for us, this is allowing us to help celebrate the generosity of the people of Massachusetts, particularly here at Mass General, who came to our province's aid in such a human way. Beth, I must tell you, I've said this morning, but as you relay the story of your parents through your eyes, it begins to put that human face and human experience that all of us can relate to even 100 years later. The mayor who was with me spoke about this lady who had lost so much. She lost everything. Can't understand the devastation of losing one child, but losing all 10, and losing her husband. That becomes the human part of this story. And the fact that all these years later, we're still recognizing it, but I believe we're also celebrating what came out of that. As I said last night, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind was formed from the devastation of that explosion. When you, as I said last night, something commotion outside of our house, what's our first instinct? Go to the window. Well, that morning, that was the worst thing you could do, and we lost a lot of people, lost eyesight. The lessons the Canadian Red Cross learned from working with American Red Cross, it was the first time that we had actually responded to a disaster inside of our own country. We were often looking at what was outside. But I think one of the things, and the mayor and I were touring around here, that really puts this, really I think tells you how extraordinary the act of kindness and generosity from the people of Boston that day is when you put it in the context of what was happening in the world. World War I was taking place. Many challenges here in your own communities. A year later, we arrived, but without hesitation. A telegram from a banker that we just found out, the mayor and I found new information out today. The first telegram was from a banker to a banker here. No more bad words about those bankers. And that banker here took it to the State House. Mass General then responded. And within 12 hours, you were coming to aid our city, but to aid the people of our city. And while we can build all of those houses back and we can fix all of those roads, nothing can replace the human spirit and the human desire to come and support and allow people to lean on you. When you look at those pictures, you can only imagine what those families would have felt like that morning, and to see you arrive as nurses and doctors, come to help our nurses and doctors who were responding to those families. I can't imagine what they must have felt when they saw that happening. So on behalf of the people of Nova Scotia, let me say thank you for not only what you did, and your sisters did, and your brothers did, and your parents did in 1917, but what we've continued to be able to do since then. So much we've learned from that disaster, whether it's how we respond to people, the medical events we've made, the connection between Mass General and the relationship between nurses. It's wonderful to see that flourish here, learning what your sisters did back in 1917 to respond. Let's continue to build on that friendship and relationship. As we watch what's going on in the world, no matter where it is, we see lots of terrible things. We see lots of crazy things that people do to one another. let's use this and our opportunity to build on how you actually truly should respond to someone in crisis and how you respond to another human being. Our communities did it right in 1917. Now the torch is sent to us to continue to build on that. And I think we're doing an okay job to make sure that we continue to remember their legacy, but also look at all of the possibilities, how we can learn from one another and support one another as communities. Thank you for giving us the chance to come here to be part of, to see the wonderful history lesson that we received as we were walking around. And for me, as you can tell, I'm a proud Nova Scotian. I'm very proud of the history of our province. But as you were walking around, I can tell what this means to you here too. And we very much appreciate the fact that not only did you respond then, but you continue to ensure that it is an important part of Mass General's legacy as well. Thank you all so much for allowing me to be with you.
And may I just add to that it is it's been such a privilege and an honor for us to have this exhibit here. You know, clearly we are talking about the medical history and innovation involved, but it's such a crucial story for Boston and Massachusetts and for Halifax, and it has been an absolute honor to work on this. So may I thank again the Honorable Stephen McNeil and also His Worship Mike Savage, the Mayor of Halifax, for being here, and also the first responders and the nurses from Canada, and also the members of the MGH Nursing History Committee for being here. It's a pleasure to be among you. So with that, allow me to introduce today's speaker, who I know we're all excited about. Dr. Deborah Sampson received a doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania. Her research is focused on the history of patient care across professional, regulatory, cultural, gender, racial, religious, and geographic boundaries. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Nurse Practitioners, and she was inducted into Sigma Theta Tau at Yale. She's held numerous clinical, academic, and administrative positions across the U.S. She's been a senior advisor and consultant to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. She's taught at the University of Michigan, Yale, and Penn, and the University of Saigon. And she has international research and consulting experience in West Africa, Central America, and Southeast Asia. She's a part-time clinician at Southern New Hampshire Health, and she's continuing her scholarship on 2 projects. One is about Harriet McKay and the Boston area nurses who worked with Elliot Joslin to implement diabetes care in the home, and the other, a book about nursing care during the Halifax disaster. She lives in Hancock, New Hampshire, but she's a native of Westford, Massachusetts, and her initial interest in the Halifax explosion was partly serendipitous, but perhaps natural given her own family heritage from Nova Scotia and Boston. With that, let's welcome Dr. Sampson.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay, wonderful. Let me move this so I can also see my own written words here. First of all, I want to tell you how thrilled I am to be here and incredibly humbled to be asked to be part of this group. I am, for all of those lovely things Susan just said, first and foremost a nurse. A 5-letter word, and that is the core of who I am and what I do for my work. I think that there's something about nursing that is somewhat unique, and other nurses know what it is. We instinctively, wherever we go in the world and we meet each other, we get it. We take care of people's needs, and we do it from a very deep place in who we are. We do it across all kinds of boundaries. Now, sometimes that's not true, depending on political situations, sociocultural situations, but for the most part, nurses care from their depths. And that caring is professionalized in what we do, with a basis of science, culture, sociology, and weaving those things into understanding how to move into chaos and sort it out from the confusion and create something that enables people to receive what they need. I want to thank you all for being here. When I first accepted the opportunity to do this talk, I was not expecting quite so many people or such a diverse crowd. And I must admit that last night I was a little bit nervous. But I saw Beth do her talk, and I thought, well, all right. She spoke so genuinely and from her heart about her own experience. I thought, well, this will work out just fine. And you all have welcomed me since yesterday so warmly. So I'm honored to be here with all of you. In this talk, I'm focusing on nurses, and I don't mean to ignore the rest of the groups of people in different professions who cared well for others and who put their own lives at risk. But this is the focus of my work, so that's what I will do today. But first, I'd like to thank those who have been supportive of my work. Now, you all know the tartan on the left by now, right? Well, that's the Massachusetts tartan on the right. All right, so that's the two tartans, and the symbols of the different places are there for you to see, the comparisons. Notice how similar they kind of are. And if you look at a whole compendium of tartans, there's such diversity, but these are fairly similar. The people who have been most wonderful to me, Janet Kitts, who those of you from Nova Scotia may know her. Her husband was a former mayor of Halifax. She welcomed me with open arms and made all of her private collection open to me for use. It was incredibly meaningful, and you will see some of those photos today. Not very few of them actually are seen in public, unless she has dispersed them to others. Certainly Dr. Jock Murray, who is a neurologist at Dalhousie, has done a tremendous amount of work, and he too has embraced me warmly and given me as much of his work as I needed, and I appreciate that. Mass General Hospital School of Nursing alumni, particularly Susan Fisher, who first connected with me when I could find nothing about nurses from Massachusetts in the Halifax disaster. She had archives that were not yet sorted and found things for me that you will see in today's work that I never would have had any other way. I'm very grateful. Nursing History Nova Scotia, you folks have some items on your webpage, on the CAHN webpage, that enabled me to speak better about Nova Scotia nurses. And that I was grateful to find. Gary Shitlak, when on my first visit to Nova Scotia Archives, he was terrific, and he had a great sense of humor, and showed me some wonderful things. Alan Ruffman, those of you from Nova Scotia may know him. He is a marine geologist, I believe, has critiqued my work, and he spared no detail, and I can't tell you what that means for a historian, because unless we get critique, we don't get it right. The photos, many of them are in public domain. However, some of them come from Janet Kitts' collection and Jock Murray's, as well as Nova Scotia. And I've received research funding. I do want to acknowledge that. The Dennis R. Caldwell Fund has been incredibly generous, because Dennis R. Caldwell is also my research assistant and my spouse. And historians don't get very well funded, and he has been incredibly generous in allowing me to use whatever of our personal funds I needed to do my work. He will be at the tree lighting with me tonight. And he is also a historian of the socio-cultural political aspects of using aviation as a mechanism of suppression. So I'm very fortunate to have a great research assistant, and he's also fun. Now, everybody here, I'm assuming, knows geography and knows the geography of our region, but I do want to point out a few things. Boston and Halifax are incredibly close if you go across the ocean. It's somewhere between 300 and 400 nautical miles. That's not that far. And indeed, at least when the weather is good, taking a boat from Boston to Nova Scotia is not a difficult thing to do. The railroad distance from Boston to Nova Scotia in 1917 was between 600 and 700 miles, depending on whose work you believe. And that also wasn't that terribly far. It's from Boston to Ann Arbor, Michigan, for example. It's not a terrible distance. We were very close, and we were very close in distance. Now, I was a little surprised to see this because my personal interest in this disaster is very deep, very serendipitous. I grew up in Boston, and every Christmas we kids would be taken to see the tree. Nobody ever told me where the tree came from. Nobody ever told me the story of the tree. And my parents, my mother's a Bostonian of many generations, and my father is from Nova Scotia. He's from Cape Breton, and I, because of him, have Canadian citizenship.
Nice.
But he who heard the explosion, as did his family, when they were still in Canada at that time, never spoke about it. So I knew nothing. Isn't that amazing? I would wager to guess that almost no one in Nova Scotia has forgotten about this explosion, and all too few people in Boston even know it exists, and that includes me. Until my spouse in 2003 said to me, "You really need to know where your parents came from." Well, I knew Boston because I lived here. My father had come to Boston in 1928 with his parents and 4 of his siblings. They had sent the other 10 siblings to Boston. Well, big families in those days. To Boston for better opportunity and educations. So my father was in junior high school age, and they came down and lived in Malden, and that's where he grew up. I occasionally heard them speak about Nova Scotia at family gatherings, and my grandparents loved Nova Scotia fiddle music, which my father said was old-timey junk. Now, I want to tell you, I am a Natalie McMaster fanatic, and Donnell Leahy, who was really from Ottawa, but that's okay. Or I guess he's from Ontario, rural Ontario. My father wouldn't allow that music in the house. Amazing. So my husband said, let's go to Halifax, let's go check it out. He'd been there. So he flew me up, we rented a car, we drove into Halifax, and I started to weep because I had come home and I could see it. It looked like the Boston of my childhood, except it was a little bit cleaner. No offense to Boston. And there was something about that city that almost reverberated in every cell of my body. We took a tour up to Cape Breton and came back to Halifax, and we're walking along the waterfront and walked in a bookstore. And there's a table about this thing called the Halifax explosion, and I looked at it. Now, I'm working on a PhD dissertation in history, so I'm looking at this and saying, what was that? And I grabbed a book and started to read and was enthralled and ashamed that I knew nothing. I bought every book in the bookstore, packed it up and took it home. Finished my dissertation in 2006 and started on the Halifax disaster story of the nurses because I could not find it anywhere. There are little dribs and drabs here and there in some of the work, but as often happens, the work of nurses was not published. the work of Richevsky and the Relief Commission and a lot of other incredibly important things were Samuel Prince's master's dissertation or master's thesis at Columbia on disaster, reconstruction, and preparedness is still the foundation of what we do today. He was from Nova Scotia, and I believe he did his dissertation in 1930. The development of medicine and surgery was aptly discussed. Wartime and maritime analyses were aptly discussed, and rapid rebuilding and infrastructures. Then we had Janet Kitz's great work on the survivors. She did beautiful, beautiful oral histories, and the city under reconstruction, and of course there's also a lot of other popular work, but nobody knew about the nurses, and I said, oh, I think I just found my life's work. So, I learned about this incredible history, and I wanted to ask the questions, and I returned to Halifax in 2006 and 2008 to do some of this work, to find out how did the nurses contribute to the care of survivors, injured, dead, and others. How did they do what nurses always do, create order out of chaos and attend to whatever needs to be done? So, as I started the work, I realized that this is the story of this geographic place and its histories. And I did include Washington, part of Washington and New York here because they did too send aid, as did other sectors of Canada. Now, our shared history and geography is very old. The earliest European settlers in both regions were predominantly British, Irish, Scotch, Welsh, and French immigrants. And until the American Revolution, we were part of the same French and subsequently British colonial initiatives. We were the same place. The linkage to Halifax and Boston was more than commerce, war, and whatever else in 1917. And I think it's difficult for us to think about this disaster without thinking about what we've heard about, the cultural, familial, and economic ties of the Eastern Maritime Canada and Eastern New England states. Until the American Revolution, we did not have a boundary or a border. There was none. However, in the 1770s, with the American Revolution, we did have a border. And of course, a lot of folks left Boston and went to Halifax to avoid that rabble down in Boston who were creating this revolution. So even until World War II, there was little in the way of a boundary or border crossings between our two countries. Unlike other European and Asian immigrants in the 1800s and early 1900s who were required to go through formal U.S. immigration procedures at places like Ellis Island, Canadians from the Maritimes were not required to register to cross the border, nor were people from the United States in this eastern sector required to do that to go to Canada, particularly to Nova Scotia. We were not considered to be foreigners to each other. Throughout the industrial era of the 1800s, the New England coastal cities of Boston and Lynn, Massachusetts, and certainly Providence, Rhode Island in particular, attracted laborers from the farms and fishing villages in Nova Scotia who, like my grandparents, found factory work in places like Providence to be more lucrative and steady than farming the rocky hills of Cape Breton or fishing in the treacherous waters off the Atlantic. My grandparents, indeed, separately went to Providence, Rhode Island to work in the mills, the textile mills. They met each other and married there. He originally was from Quebec, but had been in that forced movement to Cape Breton because he was French. But my grandmother had grown up in Cape Breton, and they subsequently, after they married, went home to the family farm in Cape Breton. Even in the 1800s, it was not unusual for Nova Scotians to attend college in New England. and maritime Canadian single women came to New England in the 18 and 1900s to find work in the factories and as teachers, nurses, household help, and shop girls. A large percentage of the nurses who trained at Mass General Hospital and the Deaconess and other prestigious hospitals in Boston came from maritime Canada. These were Protestant women of Scotch, Irish, and British heritage. In Waltham, Massachusetts, a Nova Scotia nurse set up the prestigious Waltham Nurses Agency in the 1900s and placed trained nurses of Nova Scotia heritage in wealthy homes throughout the Boston area to do home nursing. The wealthy wanted the Nova Scotia nurses. So, undoubtedly, at the time of this disaster, many of the trained nurses in Boston and New England had family and friends in Nova Scotia, even if they themselves had not come from there. Now, Nova Scotia during World War I, Halifax was a beautiful harbor. It was the largest and busiest shipping port to North America. It was the crossroads for the transatlantic transportation and wartime shipping nexus for both Canada and eastern United States. Soldiers, munitions, supplies crossed the Atlantic to Europe from Halifax and came back through there to offload cargo, soldiers, etc. before sailing down the coast. The shipyards and railways in Halifax were vital to North American commerce and war efforts. And Halifax during World War I was, much like today, a cosmopolitan and very lively city. Nova Scotia Harbor, as we know, excuse me, I'm sorry, but my papers were dropped and I didn't quite get them back into order. There we are. On a beautiful, clear, unusually warm morning, December 6, 1917, two ships collided in this harbor. One was a French munition ship, and that caught fire, loaded with highly volatile munition chemicals that exploded 10 minutes later. The explosion, as we know, was the largest non-nuclear, human-made explosion in history, sending a 2,000-foot oily smoke plume skyward. And a pressure wave resulted from the explosion that obliterated buildings within a mile of the harbor. Churches, businesses, homes were destroyed, thousands injured and dead. Buildings 10 miles away sustained damage. And throughout the city, almost all windows were broken or shattered. Flying glass shards blinded hundreds and slashed thousands. And a powerful, explosion-related 50-foot tsunami surged over the devastated area, washing everything, including living people, back into the harbor where those people drowned. Fires from overturned wood stoves and coal stoves further ravaged the city at a time when 25% of the firefighters had died in the explosion. Whole neighborhoods disappeared. The main commissary of the busy harbor, the harborside rail yard, and the downtown business district were unrecognizable. The city was destroyed. To make matters worse, many survivors feared that the explosion was a German terrorist act, and rumors started circulating in the city that a second attack was due. Things were really bleak. Yet the disaster would become even worse when by noon the next day a major blizzard would start and blanket the city in over a foot of snow, covering the ruins with blackened slush that would turn to ice. The heavy populated area around Halifax Harbor was a chaotic ruin. Transportation, communication, government, social order, and other infrastructure was damaged. Immediate disaster relief of unthinkable proportions was critically needed. Canadian towns near Halifax immediately sent relief, clothing, food, as well as medical supplies and what nurses and physicians they could spare. went to the Halifax hospitals, but the magnitude of the hardship could not be alleviated with regional resources. Massachusetts Governor Samuel W. McCall, immediately upon receiving the news of the disaster, got together with other leaders of Boston, Massachusetts, and responded with, quote, "I'm sending a corps of our best state surgeons and nurses in the belief that they may be of service to you in this hour of need. I hardly need say to you that we have the strongest affection for the people of your city and that we're anxious to do everything possible for their assistance at this time. We are ready to answer any call that they may make upon us," end quote. In the meantime, prior to the explosion, the nurses in Halifax had started a routine day of patient care, as nurses do. But suddenly, an explosion and shockwave rocked their city, and a routine day of nursing care in hospitals and community became anything but, as the injured began to arrive at the hospitals in dire condition, mutilated, burned, blind, and in physical and emotional shock. Gloria Stevens' excellent work on the experience of those nurses has helped us to understand their context. At Victoria General Hospital, many graduate nurses had left for the war. The hospital nursing staff ranks were seriously depleted. Camp Hill Hospital had recently opened, but it wasn't yet fully functioning. Yet all hospitals, and even the infants' home for unwed mothers, were teeming with wounded in a short period of time. Nurses, both graduate and students, worked relentlessly caring for those in hospital and those in dire need, who were arriving in droves. The nurses mobilized to create order out of the chaos, receive, sort, and triage patients whose cause of injury they did not even know. The nurses undoubtedly mobilized supplies, bedding, food, water, and space that became increasingly scarce as the day wore on. They did this, and they were caring undoubtedly for their own friends and family and neighbors. And in the midst of this, they focused on those in need while compartmentalizing as best I'm sure as they could their own fears for home, family, and safety in their city, not knowing whether the city was going to be next attacked by a hostile German air force. They also had no idea whether help would be coming. They could little know nor have time to consider that massive help had already started mobilizing from nearby towns and cities and as far away as Washington, D.C. and Ontario. The recently organized Massachusetts Public Safety Committee had a well-funded and structured disaster relief team. It included members of the state military guard, including a cadre of nurses and physicians. And within less than 12 hours of receiving word of the explosion, this committee organized the relief expedition to Halifax. By noon the next day, the commission had sent off its first relief train to Halifax with 12 physicians, 10 nurses, 4 railroad managers, and of course, 6 members of the Boston Press, along with a carload of supplies, including a 500-bed emergency hospital. Of the 10 nurses on the Halifax Relief Commission train, we know for sure that 2, the McInnes sisters, had come to Mass General from Nova Scotia to become nurses. The train was closely followed by the Boston Red Cross Hospital Unit train led, excuse me, I have to say that I cannot permit photos of these things. Some of these are protected photos. Forgive me for that. The train was closely followed by the Boston Red Cross Hospital Unit train led by Samuel Walcott of the Red Cross and Dr. W.E. Ladd of Boston City Hospital. This unit had 22 physicians, 67 women nurses, including male nurses, along with 14 civilian workers. At the same time, Dr. E.A. Codman, a Boston ophthalmologist affiliated with Mass Eye and Ear, left Boston with 10 physicians and 4 nurses, all of whom he had trained in eye surgery and special care. But Boston and Massachusetts were not the only places in New England from whence help was sent immediately after the disaster. The Providence, Rhode Island Hospital sent 52 physicians and 52 nurses, and the Rhode Island Red Cross sent a train with 60 physicians and 60 nurses. Major G.M. Elliott of the State of Maine Guard arrived in Halifax with 12 physicians and 13 nurses. The Red Cross in New York City and Washington also dispatched relief almost immediately, but in smaller numbers and with fewer nurses and physicians. Of course, immediately after the explosion, Halifax leaders began setting up medical relief stations in buildings deemed structurally sound. Several hospitals were reasonably intact, while relatively undamaged and usable schools and other large public and private buildings were commandeered as relief stations, hospitals, emergency housing, and ultimately boarding homes for the arriving relief workers. The Victoria Order of Nurses, women's clubs, and other civic groups were called upon to staff emergency-based relief stations and dressing stations until other help arrived. And military forces that were already in the city were pressed into civilian relief activities, hunting through the rubble for survivors, helping the remaining firefighters contain fires, and transporting the wounded and dead. Just after the first train left Boston, a blizzard of astounding proportions began to blanket New England, moving up the coast to Maine and thence to Halifax. The Massachusetts trains arrived in Halifax 2 days after they left Boston, more than twice the usual time for the trip, because they had to keep stopping to dig out of snowdrifts that came up to the windows of the train cars. And they also stopped to pick up a few relief workers in New Brunswick and other Canadian towns along the way. One can only imagine what the nurses and others on those trains saw as they came into Halifax. As the train wound its way along the waterfront, little was left along the harbor. And those nurses must have looked out the window and wondered just what they were getting into. The train station itself was heavily damaged, but it was still usable, or at least parts of it were. And while some of the arriving physicians and nurses on the first relief trains found their way to hospitals and emergency facilities, the Haligonian leaders had not had time to set up a relief worker triage system, so these folks were left on their own. Other relief nurses decided to wait overnight on the train for instructions, however, in the dark and the cold. They'd been traveling for 2 days, they were tired, they had no food, no hygiene facilities, and limited water. And they had undoubtedly seen enough of the destruction by then to know that they were fortunate to be alive, unharmed, and could soon be of use to patients and their Halifax nursing colleagues alike. Some New England nurses were dispersed throughout the city to relieve those Canadian nurses in the hospitals. Others, such as those with Codman and Ladd, set up hospital facilities in the YMCA, college buildings, the Salvation Army. Some specialized units, such as Codman's, remained at the same facility throughout their stay in Halifax. In Codman's unit's case, this was especially important since the nursing staff were specially trained in assisting during and after eye surgery. Hundreds of patients with serious eye injuries inundating their unit were cared for by this team in the first few days, and it is entirely probable that these highly specialized and knowledgeable nurses actually performed some of the surgical procedures, given the overwhelming number of eye injuries and the scarcity of trained eye surgeons. The scene that those New England nurses saw in the hospitals is also hard to imagine. Whole families and cartloads of injured had streamed into the hospital. The largest hospital, Victoria General and Camp Hill, had only a maximum of about 100 beds each, but they now totaled all the hospitals in the city housed over 1,000 injured people, the majority at Victoria General and Camp Hill. Many injured were covered with oily soot from the explosion smoke, and they were unrecognizable. The nurses were overwhelmed, I'm sure, in Halifax by injured, as were the physicians trying to perform emergency surgery before relief arrived. Food, water, beds, and adequate shelter were scarce. Sanitation facilities, power, and fuel for lighting, heating, cooking, and sterilizing were limited or non-existent. Window openings that were devoid of glass in these facilities were covered by blankets or rubble tacked up to the window frames. Now, mind you, there's a blizzard going on too, so we can think about that context. And every inch of floor space was taken up by injured and bleeding people. Frantic family members pushed through this chaos looking for loved ones among the injured, and it was into this landscape that the relief nurses arrived. Now, it appears that in the immediate relief period after arrival, the relief nurses relieved their Halifax counterparts, many of whom had been non-stop working for almost 3 days in horrific conditions, for which their hospital training could hardly have fully prepared them. And further, these Halifax nurses had no idea of their own family and friends unless someone had managed to get their way to the hospital. The New England nurses picked up and continued what the Halifax nurses had heroically initiated, to continue to create and maintain order, triage patients, bandage wounds, assist in surgery, direct lay volunteers, support physicians, help families find loved ones among the injured, work with authorities to identify and catalog the injured and the dead. Some of the relief nurses and physicians were sent to set up hospitals and buildings that were not medical facilities. When the relief workers arrived, their first task was often to clean up rubble, scrub dirt, install makeshift covering on the windows, and organize facilities for care. Corinne Samuelson, an MGH graduate and relief nurse, recalled that everyone pitched in to help. Nurses took charge. They directed everyone else, including the physicians, and the nurses had the leadership for organizing the facility. One group of relief nurses were sent to St. Mary's College, where an intact school building was hastily organized into a fully functional, clean, and orderly hospital complete with dining facilities and operating room. The chief nurse's desk and work area on the stairway also served as an observation point and a guard station for the women and children's wards upstairs. This is a very interesting facility. That top picture is a picture of St. Mary's College just prior to the explosion. In all, there were 58 hospital facilities and dressing stations to serve the wounded and survivors, using schools, hotels, private social clubs, manufacturing facilities, social service agency buildings, businesses, and of course, hospitals. And undoubtedly, as in other disaster situations, nurses took on medical roles that would be reserved only for physicians in other circumstances. Although wartime-related nursing shortage at Victoria Hospital meant that nurses there already had been trained to administer anesthesia and assist in surgery, these practices were bestowed by physicians who were almost always present and sanctioned nurses doing their work. Nurses, however, were making medical decisions during this disaster. I have evidence of this. They were making medical decisions about patients' conditions, who should go to surgery ahead of others, who could be saved and who couldn't, whose injuries were immediate, who could wait, who needed medication and in what dose. In the case of Codman's staff, as well as other venues, nurses were performing components of the surgery. Dr. W.B. Moore notes in his Halifax disaster memoir that he often left in the middle of treating a patient medically or surgically to go to someone more seriously injured and left the rest of the care to the nurses, who were fully capable of doing them. Nurses were responsible for determining who received scarce pain-relieving medication of morphine, and they were left to determine independently the dose for each patient. Moreover, during the first few days after the explosion, women gave birth in unprecedented numbers, and nurses delivered the babies. Now, there may have been many Nova Scotia nurses who in their training had also been trained as midwives, but the nurses from Boston may not have received that training. It was not common in the States for that to happen, and yet, undoubtedly, they did it anyway. New England relief nurses were housed in private homes throughout the city or slept in makeshift places in the buildings where they worked. Some were housed in convents. That was a very foreign place to these Protestant nurses. Very foreign, who, because of strict religious cultural boundaries in cities like Boston at that time, likely had little in the way of contact across Catholic Protestant boundaries. Boston, at that time, as were many cities, had very strict religious boundaries. Adele Richardson, Mass General Hospital graduate of 1915, was one of those housed at Sacred Heart Convent with nuns, and she wrote to her fellow alums, quote, "It was a strange place indeed, but the sisters were charming and most kind to us all," end quote. She further noted that the nuns always brought them tea and a snack whenever the nurses came back from performing their duties, took care of their linen, tidied their rooms, and acted as wonderful hostesses. A few of the more fortunate nurses, such as those on the first Halifax relief train, were housed in the comparatively luxurious Nova Scotia Government House. And for those of you from the States who don't know, this is where the royal family is housed when they come to Nova Scotia. It was relatively less damaged, and it was in quite an elegant section of Halifax. Nonetheless, as the urgent period passed and order had been restored, the United States nurses integrated with their Halifax colleagues to care for their convalescent patients, but only for a very short time. Most of the New England relief units stayed in Halifax for only a few weeks or at most a month. A few of the New England nurses and some of the physicians remained somewhat beyond February, following the explosion. Yet other disaster relief from New England, particularly Massachusetts, continued for several more years as Halifax was rebuilt. But this is not the end of the story. And there, of course, there's a whole lot more to this story. During the influenza epidemic of 1918, Boston was hit particularly hard. Halifax sent physicians, nurses, and relief to Boston to help support a city whose resources, healthcare facilities, personnel, and disease containment efforts were seriously strained. So Halifax was giving back. It's more than a tree, although we love the tree. So what do we make of this rapid, intense, massive relief effort? Was it just neighbor helping neighbor? Was it, as is all too often Unfortunately, U.S. economic self-interest supporting the major shipping port on the North American coast? Or was it something else? Was it that there were no boundaries? I believe that a significant factor in this cooperation, concern, and intensive efforts for Boston toward Halifax, in particular, but perhaps throughout New England as well, is that for Boston and Nova Scotia, we are cities of the same people. We share race, ethnicities, culture, language, political ideals, and history. We have no linguistic and very few cultural boundaries that would have required those relief nurses to adapt to new ways, except perhaps for those nurses living in the convent. But even then, there was enough shared culture to suffice. Eastern Canada and the US have no state-regulated borders or immigration barriers for these people, and indeed, travel between Boston and Halifax was commonplace, whether by rail or by sea. Going down to Boston or running up to Halifax or down east, as my grandparents would say, was what people did. And therefore, we shared families, workers, education, opportunities, and certainly our roots of professional practice. For example, although there were some differences with Canadian and US training, our nursing professional education and practice have roots in the same culture of the Nightingale methods that values professionalism, cleanliness, order, discipline, and taking care of those in need. New England nurses could step into a Halifax hospital and quickly understand the needs and the routine. But perhaps even more than this, many of the relief nurses would have been Canadians themselves, the majority from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Fully 50% of the nurses who came to train at Mass General were from Nova Scotia. They then would have seen no boundaries in going home to Halifax to help. Of course, I have a lot of questions that I've yet to answer. I'm intrigued, for example, by the presence of the male nurses in the Boston Red Cross contingency. I have not found much about them in the archives or their names. My suspicion is they were trained at McLean Psychiatric Hospital, and they were part of the contingency. McLean was right next to NGH, as I recall, and men could only train as nurses in psychiatric hospitals in those days, but nonetheless, they were there. I really would like to have been able to identify the country of origin for all the U.S. nurses whose names were in the Halifax Disaster Personnel Register, but I haven't found a significant amount of information yet, and perhaps there's help in the audience. Yet I suspect that the majority might have been Nova Scotian. But nevertheless, this extraordinary disaster and an examination of the nursing response provides us with fresh insights into the interrelatedness of American-Canadian nursing history and culture, particularly in terms of women in Canadian-U.S. nursing in the early 20th century, and the experiences of these nurses in a dire situation, and also their support of the physicians developing medical and surgical expertise. It gives us a lot of insight into how nurses cross borders and provide the care that they are needed to give. Thank you.